President Ibrahim Traoré rides in his big black car through the dusty streets. For 6 months, he has ruled his country from behind dark windows. But today, he sees a hungry girl selling old vegetables. He does something no one expects. He tells his driver to stop. His guards panic as he steps out into the real world. What happens when a powerful leader meets a poor child face to face? Can one small moment change how he leads his country? The presidential motorcade glided through the dusty streets of Ouagadougou like a black serpent, parting the city's traffic with silent authority. 5 identical black SUVs with tinted windows moved in perfect formation, a visual representation of power insulated from the world it governed. In the central vehicle, President Ibrahim Traoré sat with military posture, his expression betraying nothing of the man beneath the office. 6 months had passed since the young military captain had ascended to the presidency. The transition from soldier to statesman remained incomplete, evidenced by the crisp military reports spread across his lap rather than civilian briefings. His aides had learned that old habits died hard with their leader. He still preferred field assessments to diplomatic summaries. The burden of leading Burkina Faso weighed on him visibly today. New intelligence suggested increased insurgent activity in the northern provinces. 3 villages had reported night raids. Economic projections showed continued decline in agricultural exports, the country's economic backbone. Meanwhile, international organizations pressed for democratic reforms with thinly veiled threats of sanctions. These were the dragons he battled daily, invisible to the citizens who glimpsed only his stoic profile through bulletproof glass. The French ambassador is requesting another meeting, Mr. President, his chief of staff said, breaking the silence. He claims to have a new proposal regarding security cooperation. Traoré nodded without looking up from his reports. The French, former colonizers turned partners, always had proposals that somehow benefited Paris more than Ouagadougou. Just another complexity in the labyrinth of leadership. Outside his hermetically sealed vehicle, ordinary Burkina life continued in its vibrant, struggling rhythm. Market women balanced impossible loads on their heads, their colorful wrappers creating moving rainbows against the ochre dust. Young men gathered around motorcycle repair shops, their innovative solutions to mechanical problems representing the ingenuity born of necessity. Students in uniform walked to school clutching precious books, their education the hope of families who sacrificed to pay school fees. And in the shadows between buildings, those forgotten by prosperity fought their own daily battles for survival. The contrast was stark between the presidential procession and these citizens, the very people Traoré had promised to serve when he took power in the name of patriotism and progress. The president's aide cleared his throat, gesturing to a tablet displaying the afternoon's schedule. "We'll arrive at the military academy in 15 minutes, sir. After your address to the cadets, you have the Economic Council meeting, followed by dinner with the Chinese delegation regarding the new infrastructure investments." Traoré nodded, his world a carefully orchestrated sequence of meetings, speeches, and strategic decisions. The rhythmic click of his security detail's radio transmissions provided a constant soundtrack to his days, a reminder of the separation between himself and ordinary citizens. In Campbell's terms, this was his ordinary world, a place of power but also profound isolation, where even the air he breathed was filtered through protocols and procedures. Little did he know that this ordinary world was about to be disrupted by an encounter that would challenge his conception of power and purpose. The motorcade slowed to a crawl as traffic congested near the Grand Marche intersection. President Traoré's security team radioed ahead, discussing alternative routes to maintain the schedule. The president half listened to their efficient problem-solving while his eyes drifted to the window, a rare unscripted moment in his regimented day. Through the tinted glass, the bustling street scene appeared like a living diorama of the nation he governed. Vendors hawked everything from imported Chinese electronics to local mangoes. A group of young men in faded European football jerseys argued passionately about politics, their animated gestures reflecting the newfound freedom of expression since the latest revolution. Nearby, 2 elegantly dressed businesswomen spoke into smartphones, representatives of the emerging entrepreneurial class. Then his gaze fell upon what his security protocols would classify as a non-essential detail, a small figure huddled against a building wall in the shadow of a telecommunications billboard promising a connected future. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, dressed in a faded yellow dress that had clearly been mended multiple times. Her bare feet were dusty, her thin shoulders hunched protectively over a small basket containing a few wilted vegetables, the meager inventory of a child forced into commerce by necessity. Unlike the animated faces around her, her expression held that vacant stare of those who have stopped expecting help from the world. The presidential vehicle inched forward, and Traoré found himself turning his head to maintain visual contact with the girl. Something about her pierced through the layers of his official armor, the security briefings, policy debates, and diplomatic calculations that formed his daily existence. Perhaps it was her determined posture despite her circumstances, the way she straightened her spine when a potential customer approached, only to collapse again when they passed by without stopping. Or maybe she reminded him of faces from his own childhood in Bondakui village, children with empty bellies and old eyes who nonetheless rose each morning to face another day of survival. Whatever the reason, in that moment, the girl became more than just another citizen. She transformed into a living embodiment of everything he had promised to change when he seized power. Not an abstraction in an economic report about poverty indices, but flesh and blood, a child whose future was being determined by systems he now controlled. The Minister of Defense, sitting beside him, continued briefing on security measures for the upcoming Pan-African Conference, but Traoré found his attention split. His eyes remained fixed on the girl while his mind traveled to his inauguration speech. No child of Burkina Faso will be forgotten. No citizen will be invisible to this government. 6 months later, those words rang hollow as he watched the girl unsuccessfully try to sell her vegetables to passing pedestrians. How many more like her existed throughout the country? How many promises remained unfulfilled? The president felt an unexpected pull in his chest, not the calculated compassion of a photo opportunity or the intellectual understanding of a policy challenge, but something more primal. A human connection that transcended his office. A voice in his head, sounding remarkably like his pragmatic chief of staff, warned that the day's schedule was precisely calibrated, that impromptu stops created security nightmares, that one girl couldn't be helped without helping them all. Yet before he fully processed the implications, President Traoré found himself tapping firmly on the glass partition separating him from his driver. "Stop the car," President Traoré ordered, his voice calm but firm. The effect was immediate. His chief of security, Colonel Ouedraogo, twisted in his seat with an expression of professional alarm. "Mr. President, this isn't in the protocol. It's not secure to." "Stop the car," Traoré repeated, this time with the quiet authority that had carried him through military ranks and eventually to leadership. It was the voice that had commanded soldiers in counterinsurgency operations, that had announced the government's overthrow on national radio, that had silenced opposition in contentious cabinet meetings. The driver's eyes met the security chief's in the rearview mirror, caught between competing chains of command. After a moment's hesitation, he eased his foot onto the brake. The convoy halted with mechanical precision, like a single organism responding to an unexpected stimulus. Inside the presidential vehicle, an invisible line had been crossed. For the first time since taking office, Traoré had directly countermanded security protocols established to protect not just a man, but an institution. The Minister of Defense beside him shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the symbolic weight of the moment. "Sir," Colonel Ouedraogo tried again, "we haven't secured the perimeter. There could be threats we haven't assessed. If you need to make an unscheduled stop, let us arrange it properly." But Traoré was already reaching for the door handle. Another breach of protocol, as presidential doors were only opened from the outside by security personnel. The simple motion represented a seismic shift in the power dynamics that had defined his presidency thus far. Radio chatter erupted as security teams scrambled to respond to this unplanned development. "Eagle is moving." Repeat, "Eagle is moving without authorization." Outside, the sudden halt of the presidential motorcade created ripples of disruption through the busy street. Pedestrians turned to stare, market women paused mid-transaction, and even the ubiquitous motorcycle taxis slowed to observe the unusual scene unfolding. Smartphones appeared like periscopes above the gathering crowd, their cameras pointed toward this unexpected theater of power. Security personnel deployed from escort vehicles with practiced efficiency, radiating around the president's SUV in concentric circles of protection. Their faces were masks of professional concern beneath mirrored sunglasses, hands positioned near holstered weapons. They moved with the coordinated precision of those who had drilled for emergencies but never expected to face this particular scenario, protecting a president from his own spontaneity. As the vehicle door swung open, a small gap appeared between the hermetically sealed world of presidential power and the unpredictable chaos of ordinary Burkina life. The division that separated leader from led, governor from governed, power from its subjects, suddenly porous. When President Traoré's polished shoe touched the dusty pavement, the moment crystallized into something more than a mere break in routine. He was physically crossing the threshold that Campbell identified as crucial in the hero's journey, moving from the known world into a realm of unfamiliar challenges and potentials. As he straightened to his full height outside the vehicle, Traoré left behind the symbolic fortress of his office and entered the realm of ordinary citizens, the very people he had sworn to serve but from whom his position had systematically isolated him. The air felt different here, hotter, filled with the mingled sense of street food, diesel exhaust, and humanity that no presidential air conditioning could simulate. This was no longer governance as abstract policy but governance as direct encounter. Not leadership from behind bulletproof glass, but leadership exposed to the very reality it claimed to understand. The crowd around them grew geometrically, the sight of their president standing unscheduled in the street spreading through the market with the speed of breaking news. Shopkeepers abandoned their stalls, office workers paused their commutes, and students clutched each other's uniforms in excitement. Some pulled out phones to record this unprecedented scene. The leader who typically appeared only in choreographed settings or behind podiums now standing vulnerable in the dust of everyday life. Within this impromptu public square, invisible lines of alliance and opposition were quickly drawn. Security personnel formed a protective perimeter, their bodies creating a human barrier between president and population. Their earpieces crackled with urgent communication as the Presidential Guard commander called for reinforcements from nearby checkpoints. To them, this unplanned exposure represented the nightmare scenario they had trained to prevent, their principal breaking containment, entering unvetted territory. Maintain the perimeter, Colonel Ouedraogo barked into his radio, his eyes scanning the growing crowd for potential threats. For him, every citizen represented a possible danger until proven otherwise, the soldier's mindset that security cannot coexist with spontaneity. Meanwhile, the Minister of Defense exited the vehicle reluctantly, knowing that remaining inside while the president stood exposed would project an unfavorable image. His face betrayed the political calculation occurring behind his carefully neutral expression. Was this a crisis to manage or an opportunity to exploit? A young journalist who happened to be buying fruit nearby recognized the significance of the moment and began live streaming on her phone. Breaking news from the Grand Marche, she narrated breathlessly. President Traoré has stopped his motorcade and appears to be approaching a street vendor. This is unprecedented. The crowd's reaction formed another layer of this complex tableau. Some citizens pressed forward eagerly, hungry for proximity to power. Others hung back skeptically, conditioned by decades of political disappointment to expect that any unusual action by the powerful must conceal ulterior motives. A few market women began an impromptu praise song, their voices rising in the traditional rhythms used to celebrate important visitors. Through this kaleidoscope of reactions, President Traoré moved with single-minded purpose toward the girl, who remained pressed against the wall, watching the commotion with widening eyes. Unlike everyone else, she hadn't moved, perhaps frozen by the sudden attention or simply having nowhere else to retreat. As he approached, she shrank back further, her thin arms wrapping protectively around her basket of vegetables. Her wariness revealed a harsh truth about power as experienced by the powerless, that attention from authorities rarely heralded good news. For her, the president was not a promise of protection but potentially another threat to navigate. Traoré crouched before her, consciously lowering his stature to meet her eye-to-eye rather than looking down from his considerable height. This physical adjustment represented his first test, the willingness to relinquish the posture of authority for the position of equality. "What is your name?" he asked gently in more rather than French, choosing the language of villages over the language of government. "Aida," she whispered, her eyes darting between the president and his security detail, still calculating whether this unprecedented attention represented danger or opportunity. "Are you hungry, Aida?" he asked, the simple question cutting through political abstractions to the most basic human concern. She nodded cautiously, a small truth offered tentatively to power. In this moment, the crowd divided into witnesses and interpreters. Some saw a political stunt orchestrated for cameras that happened to be present. His security team saw a security nightmare unfolding in slow motion. The political class represented by the minister saw a populist gesture that would require contextualizing. International observers would later debate whether this represented authentic leadership or calculated theater. But between the president and the girl existed temporarily a simple human connection, the first and perhaps most significant test of whether his professed concern for his country's poorest citizens was genuine or merely rhetorical. As President Traoré continued his conversation with Aida, the world around them seemed to recede. Despite the growing crowd and the security personnel's nervous energy, a strange bubble of intimacy formed around the crouching president and the street child. Within this space, two humans connected beyond their assigned societal roles, leader and led, powerful and powerless, fortunate and forgotten. "Tell me about yourself, Aida," the president said, his voice carrying the rare quality of genuine interest rather than performative concern. Her initial wariness gradually gave way to cautious trust as she explained her circumstances. Her parents had died 2 years ago when violence reached their village near the northern border. An aunt had brought her to the capital but could barely feed her own children. At 12 years old, Aida had become essentially self-sufficient, sleeping in a shared room with 5 other children and selling whatever vegetables she could acquire each morning from the wholesale market's discards. As she spoke, her voice grew stronger, revealing an intelligence and resilience that transcended her circumstances. She described her daily routine with the matter-of-fact acceptance of those who have never known alternatives, yet beneath her pragmatism ran a current of unmistakable pride in her survival. For President Traoré, this encounter punctured the protective bubble of power he had inhabited since taking office. Here were the real consequences of statistics in security briefings: orphaned children. Here was the human face of economic policies: a girl selling wilted vegetables while her peers attended school. Here was the actual cost of political instability: childhood itself. He remembered his own origins in Bondakui village, the poverty that had been his companion before military service offered escape. Despite the decades and distances that separated that boy from the man he had become, the familiar pain reflected in Aida's eyes collapsed time and circumstance, creating a bridge of understanding that no policy brief could construct. The president's polished exterior, crafted through military discipline and political necessity, cracked slightly as this recognition settled in his consciousness. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly, but those who knew him well, like Colonel Ouedraogo watching tensely from the perimeter, recognized something unprecedented in their leader's face: raw emotional response unfiltered by strategic calculation. In this unscripted moment, removed from teleprompters and talking points, the president faced the most profound question of leadership. Was changing the system from within actually possible, or were his efforts merely cosmetic? Did the levers of power he had seized in the name of patriotic salvation actually connect to the machinery of meaningful change? Or was he merely occupying a position while the true forces of history, economic inequality, colonial legacies, geopolitical interests, continued their inexorable course? For Aida, this encounter represented something entirely different. The intimidating machinery of power, the black vehicles, armed men, and formal authority that usually swept past people like her as if they were invisible, had paused to acknowledge her existence. Her initial fear had given way to cautious hope as she recognized genuine concern rather than practiced condescension in the president's eyes. She had spent her young life learning to read people quickly, a survival skill in her precarious circumstances. Street children developed an intuitive understanding of human character that more privileged children never needed. The suited officials who occasionally visited her neighborhood for photo opportunities before elections projected a particular quality that she immediately recognized as false concern. This man was different. His attention remained steady, his questions specific rather than generic, his listening active rather than performative. In the shadow of power's spotlight, both president and child confronted uncomfortable truths about the nation they shared. He from the pinnacle of its authority, she from the margins of its concern. Between them stretched the vast distance between governance as theory and survival as practice. A moment of decision crystallized in the dusty air between them. The presidential motorcade had now been stationary for 7 minutes, an eternity in security protocols. Colonel Ouedraogo was receiving increasingly urgent queries from headquarters about the deviation from schedule. The crowd had swelled to hundreds, their collective attention focused on this unexpected tableau of power encountering poverty. President Traoré knew the political playbook for such moments. A compassionate smile, a paternal pat on the head, perhaps a small banknote pressed into the child's hand before returning to the motorcade. A perfect media moment showing benevolent leadership without substantive commitment, the time-honored performance of caring without systemic change. But as he looked into Aida's eyes, steady now as she had begun to trust him, the familiar script seemed suddenly hollow. This was the crucial test, what Campbell would identify as the ordeal, the moment when meaningful choice revealed true character. "I want to help you, Aida," the president said, his voice carrying an unusual quality his aides would later identify as genuine emotion rather than political inflection. "Not just today, but tomorrow and the days after." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew his personal wallet, not government funds, but his own. The cameras captured this detail, and the gesture would later be analyzed endlessly by political commentators. Was it calculated symbolism or authentic impulse? When does a leader stop performing leadership and simply lead? As he handed her enough money for several meals, both of them understood the inherent inadequacy of the gesture. For all his power, in this moment he was merely a man giving money to a hungry child, a temporary solution to a permanent problem. The real ordeal was not this moment of giving, but what would follow. How could he translate this single act of connection into systemic change? What would it mean to help not just the child fortune had placed in his path, but all the invisible Aidas throughout Burkina Faso? Critics would inevitably call this encounter political theater. Supporters would praise his compassion. Both interpretations would miss the central challenge, the gap between individual action and institutional transformation, between helping one child and changing the conditions that created her vulnerability. Aida looked at the money in her hand with an expression that shifted from surprise to calculation, the practiced assessment of one who has learned to evaluate resources against survival needs. The amount represented perhaps a week of her usual earnings. "This will help today," the president continued, aware of the cameras but speaking now to the child rather than to the audience. "But I want to make sure you have opportunity tomorrow. Do you want to go to school, Aida?" The question hung in the dusty air, simple in syntax but profound in implication. It offered not charity but possibility, not aid but agency. Aida's face transformed as she processed the question. For perhaps the first time in their encounter, she fully met the president's gaze without fear or calculation. A spark kindled in her eyes, not gratitude for the money, but recognition of something far more valuable, the acknowledgement of her future potential. She nodded, the gesture containing all the dignity and aspiration that circumstances had suppressed but never extinguished. "Then you shall," he promised, knowing the magnitude of that commitment in a country with limited resources and competing priorities. He motioned to his aide to take down her details: name, location, contact information. In making this commitment to one visible child, he tacitly acknowledged the obligation to all invisible ones. The true ordeal wasn't the momentary discomfort of leaving his secure vehicle or the political risk of an unscripted interaction. It was the challenge of authentic governance, making the machinery of state responsive to its most vulnerable citizens. As he rose from his crouching position, knees stiff from the unusual posture, President Traoré faced a crossroads that would define his leadership more than any military victory or policy initiative. Would this encounter remain an isolated moment of compassion, or would it catalyze the systematic change he had promised when taking power? The days following the encounter at the Grand Marche unfolded with unexpected momentum. What might have remained a fleeting moment of presidential compassion, remembered briefly before being subsumed by the next news cycle, instead catalyzed something more substantial. Within 48 hours, President Traoré convened an unscheduled meeting with his ministers of education, social action, and finance. The normally composed finance minister visibly blanched when Traoré outlined his vision, a comprehensive education initiative focused specifically on vulnerable children. A program that would begin with Aida but extend systematically to others in similar circumstances. We cannot help everyone immediately, the president acknowledged, but we must start somewhere concrete rather than everywhere theoretical. The following weeks saw the rapid development of what would be called the Initiative pour l'Avenir, Initiative for the Future. Aida became its first beneficiary, enrolled in a school near her neighborhood with her basic needs supported. But she was just the beginning. The president redirected funds from less essential government expenditures, including, controversially, cutting the fleet of ministerial vehicles by half, demonstrating that priorities could be realigned when the will existed. The military budget remained untouched, a political necessity given ongoing security challenges, but greater accountability was demanded for each franc spent. Not everyone supported these changes. Some ministers grumbled about emotionally-driven policy. Opposition figures questioned the program's sustainability. International donors remained skeptical about this unplanned deviation from agreed development frameworks. But something had shifted in President Traoré's governing approach. The man who had seized power through military means now wielded authority with a new awareness of its purpose. His speeches, once filled with abstract promises of patriotic renewal, now referenced specific children's names and circumstances. Policies were increasingly evaluated not just for their economic or security impacts but for their effects on the most vulnerable citizens. 6 months after the encounter in the market, President Traoré stood before a group of 30 formerly street-working children now in school uniforms at the official launch of the expanded Initiative pour l'Avenir. Aida was among them, standing taller, her eyes now filled with purpose rather than resignation. She had proven to be an excellent student, particularly in mathematics, confirming what many suspected, that Burkina Faso's greatest untapped resource was the potential of its children. International media covered the event, contrasting the military uniform Traoré had worn when seizing power with the simple suit he wore today. Some cynics still suggested this was elaborate political theater, but they found it increasingly difficult to dismiss the measurable results. 300 children already enrolled, with structured expansion planned to reach 2,000 within a year. Leaders often speak of helping the most vulnerable, he addressed the gathered press, officials, and children. But unless we stop our motorcades and see their faces, these remain just words. True revolution isn't only about changing who holds power, it's about changing what we do with that power. The president's gaze found Aida in the front row. She met his eyes with the confidence of someone who had discovered her own worth. Some will say a nation facing so many challenges cannot afford such initiatives, he continued. I say we cannot afford to continue wasting our greatest resource, the potential of our children. Security comes not just from weapons but from creating a society where every child has reason to believe in tomorrow. The story of the president who stopped his car became more than a political anecdote. It became a narrative touchstone in Burkina Faso, a symbolic moment when leadership pierced the barrier between abstract policy and human connection. Street artists painted murals depicting the scene. Traditionalists composed songs about it. Political scientists debated whether it represented a new model of African leadership or simply effective political symbolism. For Aida, the transformation was both profound and simple. She gained education, security, and possibility. Yet perhaps more importantly, she carried the knowledge that she mattered, that even the highest authority in the land could see her worth. And for the president, the return from this journey came in the form of renewed purpose. In helping change one life, he had rediscovered the human foundation of governance that bureaucracy and security protocols so often obscure. He had brought back from his journey into the ordinary world the most powerful elixir of all, the reconnect ion between power and its purpose.